Hello YouTube, I'm Scruffy at Scruffy Tales and welcome back to the War Zone. And in this video we will do a breakdown of some combat footage from Ukraine, the famous video that came out in the last 24 hours of two Bradleys taking on one T90 main battle tank in the middle of the small town of Stepove. And first we're gonna be taking a look at the video, and then I will speculate a bit of what is actually going on. Link to the video down below, as always. I will not show the footage because YouTube doesn't like content that includes combat footage. So only images, no moving pictures at all. Just a heads up. So moving on. And video starts with, we have the T90 here opening fire on a building here, and then a Bradley comes in this way and encounters the T90. And here, down here we have Stepove, and the Russians are coming in this way primarily. They have secured these buildings and these buildings. So the fact that we have a T90 all the way down here is a bit surprising, and it's a bit surprising, or rather interesting, that the Russians managed to get a tank this far into Stepove before the Ukrainians pushed up with their own armor to counter the presence of a Russian tank inside of Stepove. And here you can see these are the buildings that they're firing at, all the way down here at the end of this main street. Next, the Bradley takes up position and opens fire straight at the T90 with a burst, and I don't think anything that the T90 took any damage, probably facing the Bradley with the front armor. And the Bradley opens fire, short burst, hits the target, and then it pushes on. The T90 fires yet again. It's a bit unclear if they're trying to hit the building over here again, or if it's just panic fire trying to hit the Bradley, because it looks like they're actually shooting straight into the street itself. And after that brief skirmish, the Bradley moves along this way, and the T90 starts rolling back up the street towards the Russian controlled area of the town. And then the first Bradley, it continues down along this road here. As you can see here, it ends up down here. A second Bradley is by now already pushing up this way, and the T90 is slowly moving up along the main street here, and by the looks of it later on, it's gonna be trying to find a good position to start searching for the Bradleys. Now, interestingly enough, we can see up here in the green box, in the video we can see a lot of tracers coming in, flying through the air, landing up here, and causing all kinds of detonations. So this is more than likely a Bradley firing the 25mm chain gun at Russian positions up here, disrupting Russian reinforcements into this fight. At the same time, the Bradley Brad 2 is moving up along this way, and we can see an impact here out in the open, an RPG, or is it a mortar round? It's a bit unclear, but this impact appears to convince Brad 2 to pull back and head down this way again. And there we go. And as Brad 2 is moving down this way, Brad 1 leaves the area and leaves Stepove altogether, by the looks of it, following the street road down this way. And as Brad 2 is making his way over here, something really interesting happens. We have a massive, massive explosion right here. Clearly, you can see it, the shell that appears to be a Ukrainian-launched thermobaric round. It lands in the open area between the rubble, the ruins, between the ruins, and it's a massive explosion. And it is not, as far as I know, aimed at the T90. The T90 is over here. So as you can see, the shell is a bit far away from the T90 to affect it. And I also don't think they would waste such a round on a single tank. I mean, they made, even back in the 60s, they did tests with tanks and napalm and stuff like that to see if a crew could survive direct hits from napalm. And you had something like 5 minutes to get the tank out of burning napalm before it got too hot within the tank, that it became dangerous for the crew. So launching a weapon like this, you don't launch that at tanks, you launch weapons like these at infantry. So that tells me that there's probably Russian infantry that is pushed up with the tank, and the Ukrainians launched the thermobaric round to deal with the infantry in the town of Stepove. And so yes, as this happens up here, Brad 2 is now moving along this street here. And the T90 repositions. There's a massive area of smoke from the thermobaric round, and the T90 uses the smoke to leave the street and moves in between the rubble here. My guess is that it's taking up position and scanning for targets down here, thinking the Bradleys are still over here. We see a second detonation up here. Maybe a mortar round, maybe an RPG, a bit unclear, but something detonates. And as the T90 is now hiding here among the rubble, looking this way, on the street down here, Brad 2 is pushing up until he gets a line of sight along the main street. And this is where a lot of things happen in the span of a couple of seconds. We have Brad 2 positioned down here, and the T90 is now backing out of cover and ends up in the middle of the street, and Brad 2 opens fire, and it keeps firing. And round after round after round is hitting the T90. And the Brad 2, it's pushing back and forth, not remaining stationary, in order to be a difficult target for RPGs, a difficult target for drones, a difficult target for the T90 if it actually swings the turret around to open fire on the Brad. So it's moving back and forth, firing time and time again, hitting the T90. And the T90, it actually does the same. It's moving back and forth across the street here, trying to be as difficult of a target as possible. So this tells me, and it tells us, that the driver is in control. He is actually moving back and forth. He is in control of the vehicle. He's trying to make things difficult for the Bradley gunner. At the same time, I think we should assume that the T90 gunner is actually trying to find Brad 2 and aiming down this way. But this intense fire they're taking, I'm not entirely convinced that it's actually penetrating yet, one should add. But it's more than likely destroying optics, destroying telescopes, or periscopes rather, and stuff like that, making it difficult for the T90 crew to actually see the Bradley or locate the Bradley. So they're moving back and forth, and the gunner is basically at this point blind. He can't see the Bradley. Another thing to remember is, since the T90 is moving this way, back and forth like this, that means the flank, the side, is facing the Bradley. And if a Bradley is going to have any chance against a tank, it's going to have to hit it preferably in the rear, but it can potentially do some damage if it hits a tank in the flank. Now remember, this is a 25mm chain gun, not something like the CV90 with the 40mm. A 40mm automatic cannon would have destroyed a T90 in this scenario. Not so with the Bradley. And this is obviously why the Americans want to build a new Bradley, upgraded Bradley with a 50mm gun. I mean, imagine a 50mm gun hitting a T90 in this situation. That T90 would have been turned into Swiss cheese, more or less. And as this is going on, as this firefight is going on, we see multiple detonations up here. I assume these are Ukrainian mortars hitting Russians trying to push along the windbreak. And we also see over here cluster munitions, several of them, I believe 3 or 4 of them, striking this windbreak here and up here as well, I believe. So the Ukrainians are launching multiple indirect fire missions at Russians trying to push in along the windbreaks while we have a big fight in the middle of town. So this is a big assault. The Russians are pushing along the main street of Stepove, and they're pushing along these windbreaks, and Ukraine is calling in artillery on the windbreaks to keep the Russians away and relying on the Bradleys to keep the Russians at bay in the town itself. Now something interesting happens. As the T90 is going back and forth, it backs in this way, trying to find cover, and it rolls forward to take a peek. And now the Bradley hits something on the T90, and it's something. There's a big flashing explosion, almost looking like phosphorus detonating. So maybe it's the smoke launchers on the T90 that takes a hit and detonates. Very unclear, but something on the T90, on the outside of the T90, detonates and begins to burn, and it appears to be at the front of the turret. So that's why I think we're seeing smoke launchers taking hits and detonating. And yeah, the Bradley scores hit after hit after hit on this poor T90. I mean, it takes such a beating. And eventually the Bradley skedaddles and gets the fuck out of Dodge, heading down this way following Brad 1. And the T90 is left to its own devices. And then the drone zooms in on the T90, and what we see is quite extraordinary. So what we're seeing is that the T90, it's moving around back and forth, around and around, seemingly at random, and incredibly enough, the turret keeps on spinning 360 time and time again. It just goes round and round and round while the tank is moving back and forth and turning and what have you. So either there's a mechanical or electrical failure with the turret, or someone is leaning, maybe slumped over, knocked out, killed, wounded, whatever, leaning against the controls of the turret, so it just keeps on spinning. And as you can see, something is burning on the turret, and here we have the gun, and so it's the front of the turret right next to the gun, so that's why I think it's the smoke launchers that detonated from the the pounding this tank took from that Bradley. And then eventually the tank, it goes round and round and then starts moving back towards friendly territory, and it just leaves the street for whatever reason, runs over a small tree and then continues straight into this big tree here. And that tree is eventually the thing that puts a stop to this tank that appears to be just moving around at random. So the movement pattern of the tank kind of suggests that the driver is, well, potentially blind. He can't see anything if his scopes and periscopes are damaged, so he can't see anything. And or, you know, he is wounded or killed and is just leaning in over his controls, basically. Weird sounds at the end there. That was the wife being sneaking around, not making any noises. A for effort. We're now gonna move on to me speculating on the events, what is actually going on in this town as this gunfight is going on. Now, so here we have Stepove, and this is the main street, and up here is where Russia has, according to the maps, gained control of buildings and secured a foothold in the town. And the firefight that we witnessed took place down here. This is where the T90 was, and this is where the Bradley came in and started shooting, what have you. Now, what is important in taking Stepove and why Russia has failed so far is because Ukraine is in control of this main street here. Ukraine is able to move in Bradleys primarily and to set up shop down here, and then they open fire all along the main street. I've talked about this in my previous videos dealing with Stepove. If I remember, I will link them below so you can take a look what I've been talking about in the past. But Ukraine puts up shop down here with Bradleys, and since they now control the street, Russia can't cross the street without getting shot at. So that means they can only advance down this lane, and then it's kind of easy to defend. And any Russian troops down here are isolated because, you know, they can't get support across the street, because then a Bradley will, you know, make mincemeat of anyone trying to cross. So what Russia needs to do is to get their own armor to secure this main street, because if they deny Ukraine any chance to control the street, then Russian soldiers can move back and forth as much as they want along this main street, and then they can push into town and grab one building, or, you know, the rubble, that's all that remains of the buildings, rubble one building at a time. So that is why it's so interesting to see that Russia has managed to push a tank all the way down here, because, I mean, had Ukraine not been able to deal with this tank, that would have meant that Russia had basically free access to just send in as much infantry as possible behind the tank, because this street is now secure, and then just overrun the entire town, right? So this street, whoever controls this street basically controls the town. So what do I think took place here in this video? I believe that Russia has pushed in along the street here. The tank is here in support of infantry pushing along either side of the street. The tank has locked down the street. Ukraine can't do shit about it. That allows infantry to move along the buildings on either side, right? A tank or a vehicle should never take point, because that's how you can ambush it with NLAWs or with AT4s or what have you, RPGs. And you may not be able to destroy it, but you can sure as hell take out the tracks or damage it and stuff like that. So a tank or a vehicle should stay behind and use infantry like scouts, and then the infantry runs into trouble and the tank can roll up and open fire. And, you know, that is probably what took place. And we also have Russians probably here, and we have Russians over here as well in the windbreak. So Ukrainians are down here holding on to town down here. So a tank follows Russian troops along the street, provides fire support, locks down the street. Ukraine can't do anything, and Russian troops are moving through the rubble. And I suspect, as Russia was pushing down the street, making gains, they eventually ran into stiff resistance, a Ukrainian stronghold down in this area here. So this building became really troublesome for the Russians as they were trying to push down the street. And all of a sudden, the advance came to a halt, and the squads down here located a Ukrainian stronghold, and then they reported that back to the tank. And what did the tank do? Well, it moved up and opened fire point blank once or twice into the Ukrainian stronghold, right? So the Russians moved up along either side of the street as they should. Tank was in support as it should be. They ran into tough resistance. Tank rolls up and deals with that resistance, allowing the infantry to continue the push into town. Of course, that is not what happened because the Bradleys showed up. So Brad 1 came in this way, and Brad 2, remember there were two Brads, and one was over here, came in from this road here and pushed up this way, and Brad 1 came in this way and came around the corner and fired that quick burst at the T90 and shook it up a bit. T90 withdraws. Brad 1 pushes down the street here at speed. Brad 2 is pushing up here, but we see a detonation in the field. Maybe Russians up here with RPGs opened fire. Brad 2 says, fuck that shit, and pulls back down this way. Oh yeah, and it is also at this time that we see the tracer rounds from a third Bradley off screen, firing and landing hits in the windbreak up here, probably taking out multiple Russian infantry that are potentially moving in this way to support the assault on Stepove. Brad 1 moves on this way and leaves. Unclear why though, because he just came in this way, opened fire a couple of times, and then moved all the way over here and left. Brad 2 is moving down this way, and he is still in the fight. He's not giving up. And this is when that big thermobaric round drops in, landing. Oh. This goddamn headset shutting down. This is where the thermobaric round drops down right between the buildings and the gardens, creates a big explosion, and I'm guessing that they fired this round because you had Russians entrenched in the rubble. So you don't want to hit them with ordinary artillery because, believe it or not, ordinary artillery can't really do that much against entrenched enemies. So you need something like this, the thermobaric round that will... It's a terrible weapon, you know, it spreads phosphorus fire all over the place, and you know, it just seeps into every hiding hole you can imagine. And it's aimed over here and not over at the tank, so it's probably gonna be dealing with enemy infantry in this area of town and it's not meant for the tank itself. And here we go. And Brad 2 continues down the street, comes around the corner, spots the T90 and begins opening fire. At the same time, mortars are striking the Russians up here. Remember, these are the Russians that probably launched a RPG down at Brad 2 this way. And so they're now getting pounded by mortars. And at the same time, we're seeing cluster munitions dropping down over here. More than likely to deal with Russians pushing in through the windbreak here. So as you can see, it's a full-on assault. The Russians are trying to push down this windbreak, and they're bringing in a tank to support the push into town. And at this point, Ukraine, they're just throwing everything they have at the Russian. We have a thermobaric round here, mortars up here, 25mm chain guns firing over here, cluster munitions over here, and then you have Bradleys moving back and forth the streets, opening fire at a T90. So this is a big fight we're seeing in the video, even though the focus is on the Bradley and the T90, but there's a lot of stuff going on all around, all across the town. And the Ukrainians are really struggling and just throwing everything they have at the Russians at this point. And yeah, as you can see here, you have impacts up here causing damage. Same thing here. Thermobaric round caused some damage here. Ukrainians took, you know, hits from the tank point blank, and cluster munitions dropping down up here. Sorry. And now you have the Bradley, Brad 2, firing at the T90 as it's moving back and forth, trying to get out, you know, to avoid some of the incoming hits, trying to find the Bradley down the street. So the T90 is struggling at this point. And the Bradley is having a field day, moving back and forth, being a difficult target, and just keeps landing hits. And like I said, the T90, it's moving on the picture left to right. It has its flank, its side facing the Bradley. So had the tank just taken a deep breath, the crew should have taken a deep breath and then just rolled down the street. They would have been facing the Bradley with the front armor, and then the Bradley would not have been able to do jack shit basically against the tank. But the crew panicked. They tried to be smart, tried to be tactical, and that was the thing that in the end was the thing that made them lose this firefight. And of course, the Bradley stops shooting, it skedaddles this way and follows Brad 1 down this way, and the T90 spins around, dances around like John Travolta on steroids, and then runs into a tree. And that's the end of the video. So let's see here. Yeah, just to highlight, so Brad 1 would, this is, let's see here we have Berdichi. Oh yeah, using the pen. This is Berdichi, this is Ukrainian controlled territory, and Stepove obviously. So Brad 1 would come in this way, Brad 2 would come in this way to reach the town of Stepove. And it was down here that the tank was originally firing on Ukrainians in these buildings here. And then the fight continued as we saw in the video. And let's see if I can use this instead. And if you take a look at the Deepstate map, you can see here that these are the buildings here that are in Russian control. These buildings. And Ukraine is holding on to this part of town over here, so that the Russians managed to push along the street down here. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because this is where Ukraine is in control. So all of this is no man's land. And Russia managed to get a tank to push all the way down here, straight up to Ukrainian controlled positions, and opened fire point blank straight into the faces of the Ukrainians. And the Bradleys, like cavalry in a good old Western movie came in at the last second to save the day and chased off the bad guys. So, but I mean, that second Bradley taking on a tank on its own. Jesus Christ, the balls on the guys in that Bradley. I would not have done that. I would not have taken on a tank at such close range with a Bradley in an urban setting where there's just one lane of fire, where you're basically a sitting duck. But yeah, good job, Ukraine. They really handled that situation really well, I have to say. And that's it for tonight. Hopefully the computer allows me to turn this recording into a proper video with not all that much trouble with the audio, but we'll see what happens. Until next time, go March Ukraine, give them hell.